And then I do.
Hey, Talent Warriors. Today I've got a friend and a professional colleague joining us today, Bill Gardner. 30 plus years as an executive coach, and now he is actually the coach to coaches. Somebody I've known for a long time who really energized me about getting into the coaching field, and somebody that I turn to all the time. So stand by for some of the best advice from one of the most senior coaches in the globe and one of the top Forbes contributors. Hey, Talent Warriors, welcome to 2022. Happy New Year to you all. And we get to start off the year with a good friend of mine, a coach and an advisor, and somebody I really, really admire, and truly one of the nicest people on the planet. Truly, this is a coach of coach. This is the Yoda of coaches. I'm going to embarrass him when and where I can. But I was really looking forward to this episode. There's going to be some great information on really how do you assess talent from a tool perspective. So stand by as we get into what makes a great assessment and how to use them to really help your talent. Hey, Mr. Bill Gardner, welcome to the Talent War podcast and Happy New Year to you, my friend.
Good morning, George. Happy New Year to you as well.
I do good embarrassing you at the start?
Yeah, pretty good.
All right. You gotta love that. And that's why these are fun, because you listen to so many podcasts and you're just not having conversations. So look forward to have that today. So I'm going to lead off. The audience doesn't know one of the things I'll let them in on is I don't even know how many years ago, but I was given the gift by Christina, my wife, of having you as a coach. And we did the leadership circle. And I like to kid myself that I'm a pretty insightful and self-driven person to evolve. That bubble was burst after I took the test. And I learned a lot about me, but if you're open to it. So I want to get in and tell the listeners, where did your career start and how did you get into coaching?
So I'd have to go back to MBA grad school when I majored in finance and economics as an undergrad. And I went back to school to get an MBA. And my first quarter at that university, I met a man who would become my mentor. And I signed up for his class. And right off the bat, he started with an assessment. And based on that assessment, he grouped us into small groups of 8 that would be together throughout the quarter as a learning cohort. After that, there were tons of instruments as part of that program. And then when I graduated, I had a crazy opportunity to teach MBA prereqs, primarily finance and economics, eventually management, at a regional campus for that university. And Dr. Bracy, my mentor, was charged with finding a way to develop faculty members. And he picked 20 professors. You can't see, but I did quotes around professors since I only had an MBA, to be a part of an internal consulting group at the university to consult with deans and department chairmen on organizational issues as well as leadership issues. And then once a year, we brought whatever faculty members wanted to come together down on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And we did a week-long, our quarter break, a week-long faculty development. So my career shifted from finance and economics to I want to be in this line of work. I want to develop people. And I really got fascinated by organizational culture and change issues. Growing up, as everybody knows, from the state of Mississippi, I grew up in a period of the civil rights movement. So I had gone through that wrenching change process and was always fascinated by change and resistance to change. If you jump way forward, after I worked at an electric utility, a high-tech company, an industrial gas and chemicals company. And in all of those companies, I was part of leadership and organization development. Air Products and Chemicals, when I arrived there, the first leadership workshop they ever did in the history of the company was about 50 years old then. First workshop they had ever done, they used the Center for Creative Leadership Assessment. And the evaluation of that workshop, basically, every workshop you do from now on, there has to be a 360 assessment before you start the workshop. And then the workshop has to be based on the findings from that assessment.
Wow.
So for the years I was there, every development opportunity that we had to find an instrument. And eventually we started to have to create instruments to do an assessment so that we knew who was showing up. But more importantly, we knew how to target the development. What is this group of 36 leaders? What's their blind spot, or what do they need to know? And then we would alter the workshop based on that. So just quickly into the coaching piece, I didn't formally call myself a coach at any of those companies. I was an organization development specialist at one time, manager, director, eventually at AMD. And part of the change process was, I didn't call it coaching then either. In our internal workings, I called it holding leaders' hands to calm them down when things weren't going exactly as predicted, or to help them understand pushback is part of the process. We knew this was going to happen to begin with. So 12 years ago, when I left AMD and decided to start my own business, my plan was, I'm an organization development person available for large-scale organizational change projects. That's my number one product or service. Number two, I'm going to do team development. I'm not going to call it team building, because I assess a team with an assessment I developed. I assess a team before I decide what they need. And then I do team building, but it's around those needs that they've illustrated. And then lastly, I said, okay, I'll throw my hat in the ring and do some coaching. The market thought otherwise. And the market, I started getting requests for coaching. And the last 2 years, my revenues have been 80% coaching.
Wow.
Most of the other is team development, and there's a little bit of organization development, because companies, in my experience, have become less long-term focused throughout my career, but particularly now. It seems that, it should go like 3 or 4 years ago, it just hit me in the face that when you talk about a culture change, and the leader you're talking to, the CEO or whoever, says, yeah, so we need to get this done in 18 months. I can't, in all honesty, say, yeah, I'll take this on, because that's not possible. And when I say, the research shows about 6 to 7, maybe 8 years to fully change a culture so that it's changed, I just get these blank stares like, yeah, no, we're not talking that far out.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with a global, let me just say the U.S. populace. We tap our feet in front of microwaves, hoping that the 30-second reheat moves a little quicker than 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, our patience is, I hate to say that. I find myself, if I set it for 30 seconds, I've turned it off at 27. Yeah. I do have to admit to that. But it's interesting that you set out with that intention and then you end up coaching. And I've started to see that. And I know that you're helping me become a better coach. Did you like how the market turned out for you? Not from a revenue perspective, but has the individual side of coaching helped you understand the team side more, or has the team side help you understand the individual more?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, when I first went into doing the coaching, of course, I felt like, even though I could say I'd been doing it for 35 plus years, I felt a little bit like a fraud. I mean, I didn't have any kind of certification in coaching. I was just sort of basing it on my experience and what I had learned. And so I did what I tell people to do, which is I went to the Center for Creative Leadership's 5-day coaching certification and learned a very interesting thing going through that process. I don't think I picked up any new skills, but what I started to understand was the knowledge and research behind most of the stuff I had learned through trial and error. Let me just say my last few years at one of the companies that I worked for, so I don't get too personal here. I've always believed the leader has so much power and influence over an organization. But I actually went through, I don't know how many mergers and acquisitions, and then eventually the change in CEO of a company I was working for, that almost, not overnight, but it felt like overnight, the culture changed. the culture shifted because we went from a guy who every time he spoke, he said, people first, products and profits will follow. People first. Kept saying it over and over and over again. And we went to a person who, in my first conversation with him as the senior OD person for the company, said, you don't come to work to form friendship type relationships. You make commitments and you live to them. You extract commitments and you hold people accountable. And if you're looking for people that you like well enough to go to lunch with, get a dog. And that attitude shifted the company culture so quickly that I was in a meeting with a vice president of human resources who actually the whole HR leadership team, and this relatively new vice president said, he made a comment and then somebody said, well, that's because our founder, and he said, are you going to say people first? Because if you are, let me just say, apparently that's not working very well. Hasn't worked very well. And I remember that moment so vividly, I could tell you the seat I was sitting in and who was around the U-shaped table, because I went, oh my God, things have changed here like that.
Wow.
So does it help me understand teams? It helps me understand the dynamics of teams or the dynamics of organizations by really getting into the mental models and the thinking of the leader. So, yeah.
Let's just dive right into that because you've been a coach. We'll just use that term for now. I don't know if you will have the same masochistic gene in you that I've had being in recruiting for over 2 decades, but you literally see, I mean, just the sample set. One of the taglines we were asked Talent Work Group is, how many people have your teams hired? And my teams have hired over 80,000. So I've sat arguably and conducted more interviews and seen more real assessments, not with tools. But once I got into recruiting, it was the assessments that really started to, because I want to trust my gut. I want to say, okay, I've seen enough samples. I've done this enough. I've got a good beat on that. But as somebody told me once, the acronym GUT is gave up thinking. And I've kind of liked that. And so I started to lean into the assessments, but you said at the very beginning, and you used assessment tools. So first of all, tell us about the different types of assessments out there, because I think people, some may be under the misunderstanding that a Strengths Finders is the same as a Leadership Circle, or a Hogan is the same as a Predictive Index. There's any number of them out there, the Wonderlic. Tell us the basics about assessments from your view.
Okay, so I think the first question to ask about assessments always for me is, why are you doing the assessment? What's the outcome of this assessment? Because that why should drive the evaluation of any assessment instrument or the creation of an assessment instrument. While I'm thinking about it earlier, you sort of in the setup, you said the word test. And I always really struggle with saying it's not a test, it's an assessment. Because a test, our brains go to pass, fail, or what grade am I going to get on this? But that why is really important. Then looking at the assessments with that question in mind, like if you're talking to a bunch of companies that offer assessments, this is what we're looking for. This is why we want to do it. How is your instrument going to do that for us, right? Then for me, because of my academic training and background, it's really important for me to understand what is the theoretical construct that underlies this model, right? Why did they ask these questions? What's driving those questions? And sometimes that involves a deep dive into, well, these days in neuropsychology and a whole lot of other stuff that most people don't feel comfortable diving in themselves. But a vendor of an instrument should be able to give you a nice, concise, easily understood response to, here's the theoretical construct. At the bottom line, this assessment looks at how much attention span a person has, and it's based on studies that did this stuff. So why are you doing it? Does it address it? What are the theoretical constructs? Then a philosopher who looked at not just assessments, but theories and models about the way people interact. He used a model, he drew a clock face and put GAS, maybe at the Dr. Pepper points around the clock face. And he said, whenever you're trying to assess or understand a person, these three things have to be played off against each other. Generalizability, in other words, if my instrument says this person is a blue person, then are they blue at home and blue at work and blue under stress, pressure, stuff like that? That's the generalizability part. Is it accurate? In other words, can I do test, retest, reliability? Will it pick up development, things like that? And then is it simple? You can't have all three of those. You have to go for two of them and trade off the third one for business reasons or whatever. I think it's important, not theoretically, but actually to have face validity. In other words, if somebody takes an instrument and then I give them the theory and I say, so you're a blue person, they go, yeah, I don't like that, but yeah, I see why now that I understand. So I can understand it. And then this is part a lot of people miss, I think. After you've chosen, you need to set up a process for assessing the assessment. You go back through that same criteria that you did before. Now that we've used it for 18 months or 2 years or whatever, or a year or a quarter, like some businesses or folks do, now that we've used it, is it doing what we thought it would do? Is it answering the why? Do we understand the theory enough? Are we seeing it actually play out at work? If not, then we need to go back on the search for a new assessment or develop a new assessment. So that's my way of approaching it. I think I might have lost the rest of your question. I got wrapped up in my answer.
No, that's quite all right. So let's go from there. So let's just kind of stick to executives, senior leaders' performance. And I'm not going to parse out, hey, we're coaching or helping advise somebody to go from low performance to high performance. We're just stepping in to meet them where they are and take them to the best of their capability. And I want to be careful because I know your position and your reputation is everything. So I don't want to call out or say what's a good assessment, a bad assessment, a good instrument or a bad instrument. But obviously there's things that you prefer when working with executives that meet that three-pronged test, that are more reliable, more accurate, that face value. And what are those things? What do you prefer to use with executives in trying to take them to the next level of their game?
Yeah, as you said, you know me about this, and you mentioned earlier that you and I participated in the Leadership Circle. Leadership Circle is my go-to for assessing executives that will buy into a 360 assessment of them. There are many senior executives who are not open to getting that kind of feedback, or they're anxious about that kind of feedback. But if they are willing to do a 360, it's the Leadership Circle. And one of the main reasons no, I shouldn't say that. There are many reasons I like it, but a couple that stand out for me is, let me start with the most important one. It identifies or shows the level of adult development that the person being assessed is showing up as. I want to be careful about saying that's their level of development. But once I got into adult education, I found out, wow, up until now, I thought once you became an adult, you were done developing. I mean, you were adulting now, and that was everything. But when different theorists and researchers started to say, wait a minute, development doesn't stop when you're 24 or 18 or whatever. There are actually stages that you can chart of a person's developmental journey. And the Leadership Circle has that as part of the assessment, at least an estimate of where somebody is. And it's focused on two areas. One's the reactive area and one's the creative. If I could make a change, I'd probably go back. That is the stages, but it gets confused sometimes because nobody wants to be reactive. But the fact is, reactive is typically what's most responsible for leaders' success up to the point that I'm called in to be a coach. They're very reactive. They're able to move quickly and make decisions and do stuff in a very reactive manner. So the next most important thing is it gives from the beginning a look at possible mental models that the leader has. Because behavior, you can change behavior really quickly. I can change behavior tomorrow. I've changed my behavior around diet and exercise probably 10,000 times in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But until you get behind the mental model that was driving that behavior in the first place, you can't sustainably change it. And the leadership circle goes right there from the beginning. Here's what your score is. Here's a booklet to interpret it. And this is George from personal experience. Here's a possible list of mental models. If you believe this, put a check by it. If you don't, put a line through it. Now let's look at the ones that you believe, because those are beliefs and mental models that are causing you to show up less effectively than you want to show up. So that's my go-to. A lot of times executives don't want to 360. It puts them in too vulnerable a position. And so my fallback is Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I've had some experience with Hogan as well.
I'm working my way through. I'm working my way up to the leadership circle. My developmental stage is Hogan, and soon the next one's coming.
So a critical thing, since you know both models, a critical thing between these two is both are complicated. Both have, the fancy word is requisite variety.
Mm-hmm.
They are as complex as what they're trying to assess. Critically important. Hogan, for me as a coach, to help a person understand it, it takes me several hours of poring over the results and comparing between the three different reports and all that stuff. Mostly for me to try to be able to say, I can't put it on a bumper sticker for you, but let me put it on a big batch of bumper stickers to help you understand what this is. The Leadership Circle has a one-page net-out summary that beautifully illustrates the results, and not just the results, but the interplay and interaction between reactive tendencies and creative competencies. So it helps them see, the guy I was talking to yesterday, very, very high on controlling, and as the theory would predict, not that great in developing his followers or being a mentor to them or them having a good relationship with him, that driven part. And it's there on the page. You can look, oh, wow, here's this really high amount of control. And across the circle, look what it's doing to your relationships.
Yeah.
And typically the way I introduce that is to say, do you have some examples of when that need for control got in the way of your mentoring or helping somebody? And I haven't had anybody yet that couldn't, if they were at all personally insightful, be able to, oh yeah, here's an example that just happened. Or here's an example that went horribly wrong. So those two are my real go-tos. Since the last time you and I talked, I've added an instrument that I first learned about in 1977. And it has come a long way. I got back acquainted with it about 7 months ago. And what I love about it is not a 360, it is a self-assessment. I don't see it in use for my executive clients, but clients at a lower level, when I have those, and for teams, it's a really great team assessment. It has an underlying metaphor that I just love.
You got to tell me the name of it too.
Okay, well, now it's the SDI 2.0. And they're rebranding to move toward core strengths, all one word with the S capitalized. But the metaphor that I love is they use an image of a buoy in the water, right? And they say that buoy in the water is representative of your behavior as a leader or mentor or husband or wife or whatever. That's your behavior. What do we know about buoys? It can move a little bit, and it has about 360 different options depending on the context. But it's anchored, and that anchor is what they call your motivational value system. It actually is based on Sigmund Freud's 7 personalities, updated significantly. But so what they say is your motivating value system doesn't really change.
Mm-hmm.
It's the anchor. It's holding that buoy. That buoy can't go anywhere it wants to. It's chained to that motivational value system. But depending on the conditions, it can show up any way.
Yeah, I kind of like that.
almost infinite movement. So now they look at motivational value system when things are going well. And then they look when you get in conflict, what do you do? How do you try to resolve the conflict? And then they have a strengths assessment, which now they show you this is a really powerful thing. Let's say you're going to work with somebody else, and one of your strengths is you're assertive, and you know based on working with them that one of their strengths is something different, then your behavior is going to be different with them than it would be with somebody else who valued assertive. That was part of their value system. It's going to be different. So you would be assertive, but for a different reason, a different motivational value system. Just a quick example to clarify that. I come out between the three corners of this triangle are people, process, and productivity. So I come out between people and productivity. I'm not big in that process category. I'm a big picture guy. I don't like to get lost in the details.
Yeah.
But when I tell people that, and you would probably be surprised at that, given my last interaction about a Hogan assessment,
Yeah.
that I will spend hours deep diving in numbers and write-ups and stuff like that. Why? Because my motivational value system is about people. And I can do that process stuff as good as anybody else in the world. It's helpful to people.
Yeah.
But if you just say, go analyze this big data set, and I don't see a value of that to helping people, I can't even start it. I've added that to my bag of tricks, and I'm actually using it next week in an offsite for a team.
I want to back up a little bit to the leadership circle. I just wanted to know your opinions. One of the things that we talked about in our book, The Talent War, How Special Operations and Great Organizations Win on Talent. And for our listeners, we had this call out box at the back that Bill, our guest today, helped us with, which was brilliant and just really summed it up at the end. That the Army took some 200 years to add the trait of humility to the qualifications of being a good leader. Where I'm going with this, when I took the leadership circle, the thing was for me, I was like, okay, there's parts of me that are kind of fearful of what I'm going to get back from subordinates, from peers, from supervisors. And then I think I just kind of got over the better the devil. I'd rather know than live in denial. But how much of when people resist taking the leadership circle, do you immediately default and say they're not humble enough, they're not committed to self-development enough, or that fear is going to get in the way? Or do you see them saying, well, look, frankly, I don't trust their judgment. I don't know it's going to be helpful. Where do you see executives coming down on the 360 when they're not in favor of it?
So first answer to your question, no, I don't just throw in the towel when they say I don't want to do 360. My general approach to that is to say, can you help me understand a little bit about the why there? What's going on? What's the downside of doing a 360? And then I try to address my response to whatever they say. But I will say, sort of a go-to for me is the thoughts that the people that would give you 360 feedback, the thoughts that they have about you as a leader are walking around in their head. Mm-hmm. This instrument does not create an opinion about you. They're asked about behaviors to see things that you do. And so there are two options here. You can just let it walk around in their heads, which to them is truth. And by the way, their perception is how they're acting. So if they think like bad news, and it would be harmful to their career if you give them bad news, if they give you bad news, they're not going to give you bad news. Is that the kind of leader you want to be? Because this information is out there. Secondly, feedback is a gift. And having just gone through the holiday season, every year family gives you gifts that you really don't like, right?
And you hope they left the receipt in the box so you can take back. Yes.
Exactly. So I say, so here's the deal for you. If you get a gift of feedback that you just really don't like, as a coach, I'm going to push you to examine where that could have come from. Like, why are people saying that? Mm-hmm. But in all honesty, you don't have to do anything about it. You can take it back and trade it in on something that you like. Now, that's hard to do. Like I say, well, you say that you're real caring, and that you support your employees' personal development. However, we ask a bunch of your employees and they say that you don't support their development and you're not a caring person. So let's just look at that. Where could that conflict be coming from in their perception? Now, ultimately, if I'm pushed far enough, I'll just give it up and say, okay, that's their perception. Let's move on. Let's look at some other stuff. So I'm going to really push for the 360. The other thing I think is important, depending on your company or depending on who I'm pitching to, is price. Because there are some assessments that are really out there on price, and chief financial officer is probably not going to go there if their company's struggling at all. Like, I can't see myself spending that kind of money. It has to really deliver a wallop. The other thing is, I have enough senior executives I work with now that if someone is considering, but they don't want to do 360, I can give them a reference to say, if you're a CFO, if I gave you a CFO who I've used assessment with and their experience, would you be willing to talk to them? So that's where I try to get around it, because in all honesty, my heart and my head feels like 360 is going to be better, because if it's a self-assessment, all those excuses come up. Like, well, I was having a bad day that day. Not that they don't come up with 360s. Oh, when they were filling that out, we had just announced no bonuses for the year or whatever. That's reflecting that, which I always say, okay, let's add 2 positive points to all your answers. You still come out with this as your most development need. So let's talk about that. And so that's where I go with that. I'm not immediately going to drop to, okay, let's do something that's not a 360, but it's a judgment call. I have pushed some people. I probably should say I have pushed some people until they decided to go with a different consultant. That's only because in my head and my heart, I thought at the moment, a self-analysis or self-responses of this guy, I don't think it's going to work. So I'd rather not work with them.
No, I totally get that. Hey, I wanted to, a little bit off script and just check. If the answer is no, we can move on really quick. Have you ever used the Hogan pre-hire assessment? Have you ever been asked to evaluate somebody that they're considering for a C-suite or one click off the C-suite? Have you ever used the pre-hire side of that?
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
The one that pops into my head is a company that was getting ready to hire a VP of Human Resources, which was their highest human resource job. My previous client had been the person that this person was replacing. And they wanted to use the Hogan pre-hire. Obviously, it has to be legally defensible, and it is. And so I did use the Hogan pre-hire for that. What they did was they interviewed to get the top 3 candidates. I assessed the top 3 candidates and gave them the report, and I added a little twist to it. I hope I won't get in trouble with Hogan for doing this, but I asked the chief operations officer who this vice president was going to report to, would he take the values part of the Hogan assessment, but not answer it for himself, but answer it for the company? Like, what would he say the company valued? And it was sort of a dichotomy. Well, I did the 3 choices. Not of our value, very strong value, sort of indifferent to it. And so in addition to what Hogan provided, I did a values comparison based on what the boss would have said. Between the 3, there was one candidate that just, there's no way the other candidates could hold a candle to her. She was just a standout. She had all the right experience, but her Hogan lined up. She checked all the boxes for a senior leader. And so after I went through all of that with the chief financial officer and with the people that would be reporting into the vice president, they chose one of the other candidates. And to bring this conversation full circle, it was a gut feel they had that, now I should say this as well, the other 2 candidates were men and the company was predominantly male, and all the people who decided that one of the men was the better fit, I don't know whether that weighed in or not. I'm not speculating one way or the other, but they went against the recommendation and the money they had invested to have me do that pre-hire assessment. So if I could use that opportunity to just say this, I said this to a graduate class that I was talking 2 semesters ago. If you think of a relationship continuum, that at one anchor is anything whatsoever about this person. And at the other end is, I know this person so well, I could give you their bio just off the cuff. I don't have to have notes. I know the way they think. I know the way they act. I could finish their sentences for them. I could even tell you how they would act in certain situations. If you got that continuum, when you start looking for somebody for a position, most of the time you're in that, I have no clue about this person. I don't know them. I wouldn't recognize them if they walked in the room, right? So you don't want to hire somebody that you have that little knowledge of. So how do you build knowledge with them? Well, there's an assessment that's objective. There's an assessment that's objective. You could interview them. You could do a simulation if that's appropriate for the job, where you could see them in a simulation where each one of those adds information and knowledge. You're not going to get to that point where you know everything about them before you hire them, but you want sufficient knowledge. When you're building that knowledge purely subjectively, like George, you and I are both suffering from cedar fever today. Mm-hmm. If I had to interview today, different from somebody that I didn't interview them after cedar fever is gone, I'm a different evaluator. I will change between those 2 periods of time. And no matter how objective I try to be, I can't be completely objective. And now we know from neuroscience, the first bit of information we have about a person, our brain goes into a predictive process to say, oh, that guy has a beard. Can't trust him. Now, that's got to be overcome by a lot of data, or that's going to drive my decision making. So the whole reason you would do an assessment, in addition to all that other stuff that everybody does in hiring, is it at least is one piece of data that doesn't have as much noise as 6 different people.
When Mike and I opened up our book, we said, you can't see talent. You need a process that reveals it. And so I love that we've been able to talk about assessments, but I'm going to ask you an off the cuff, because we talked about 9 traits, 9 character attributes of talent. We had to boil it down. And did we get the right 9? We think we get the best 9. It's our collective, and with all of our contributors, our thoughts.
Yeah.
But of all of the executives that you have coached, if you were to have to recommend for people like me, not as a coach, but as somebody doing executive search, 3 traits that you personally think stand out amongst excellent executives, and I didn't pre-warn you about this question, so I apologize, but 3 traits that come to mind about, hey, when I feel like I have a great executive, generally they have these 3 things that are showing up. What are those 3 things?
I like thought questions. So I will tell you the first one that popped into my mind for sure was being a lifelong learner. And by that, I mean, no matter how educated, smart, or experienced they are, they see part of their process to be learning, to be constantly learning. And I'm not talking about just industry knowledge. I mean, that's all important. But I'm talking about a lifelong learner about them as a human, how they show up. You and I have had several conversations. I'm a fanatic about reflection and journaling, and that's a subcategory of lifelong learners. The best executives that I have coached from the start are the ones who came in and say, when I talk about reflection and journaling, they say, oh yeah, I've been doing that for the last 20 years. I didn't start out my career like that, but I had one guy say, once I left that senior position for the country of Africa, I thought, holy smoke, before I go back to the U.S., I've got to capture some of the boom learnings that I've had here that question what I knew. So right along with that, something you mentioned earlier is humility. Not a fake humility, but a humbleness that says, I don't know it all. And there may actually be somebody in my group who could do a better job at this than I could. So I'm going to be humble enough to accept that. What would I say would be the third one? I think it's probably an intense interest and almost fanatic need to lead. And by that, I mean have influence on other people in a way that leaves them and the organization better than if I had not been there to have the influence.
Wow.
So those are the three. And those are right off the cuff, off the top of my head. Lifelong learner is easy because I get asked the question a lot of times, like, what's one characteristic, especially from graduate students, MBA, I'm going to go out and be in a company. What's one thing you would say to me starting as a new manager? I say start off as the rest of your life is going to be, in addition to everything else, a learning experience. What can you grow from?
Yeah.
If I were going to add a fourth, I would probably say it's a clear understanding of their legacy, that how they want to be remembered. Since I coach leaders, how they want to be remembered as a leader. When they leave this company or when they leave this position or when they leave this earth, what would they love to think that the people that worked for them and were influenced by them would say about them? And the power of that in coaching is that people are going to, if you just ask them the question, how would you want to be remembered? They're going to say really lofty things. Then as we talk and they tell me an experience they just had with a subordinate or an organization or whatever, my most powerful question is often, 6 weeks ago when we started, you said you wanted to be remembered as fair above all else. Can you help me understand how what you just said you did in that situation was fair? Or a different way to answer the question is, that guy that you chewed out in front of his direct reports and you demoted, if somebody just had a video of that moment and they were given a list of characteristics, would they check fair? Would they check that you were interested in developing your people? These are the 4 things you said. I didn't give you these. Is that what they would say about you? Because at the end of the day, if you're not reflecting and saying, did I show up today in a way that would have people remember me the way I want to be remembered, then you have some changes to make.
Crazy question. And I promised you a certain amount of time before I kind of get into the final questions. Have you ever given that to an executive as homework? And I'm specifically thinking about, because I have a session today with the gentleman that you helped me with.
Okay.
And so this is reconnecting after the holidays. But that just made me think of a question. Have you ever given that as homework to say, hey, I want you to write the vision statement that says, this is my legacy of leadership. This is how I want to be remembered in this firm. Have you given that as homework?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I typically do it as homework. In my chemistry meeting, when I'm talking about my process, I describe this process. And I'll say, I'm not going to tell you what to do as a leader. I'm perfectly capable to do that, but I'm not going to do that because what I think is not important. And then I have a little worksheet that I give people to say, some future perfect thinking, go out to this point, you pick the point. When you retire, when you leave this job, when you leave this company, whatever that point is in the future, put yourself out there. So if you say, I'm going to retire at 55, now let me put myself emotionally in that place. How old are my children? How old am I? Well, I'm 55, but that's not how old is my spouse? Just whatever you can do to put yourself in that place, that future perfect thinking, and then think to yourself, depending on how much I've seen them willing to be open to some borderline woo-woo stuff, I may say, close your eyes, take a couple of deep breaths, reflect on it, and imagine that everybody's gotten together for your retirement party. All your employees, everybody you've managed or led at your retirement party. And somehow you have an ability, maybe a friend of yours is walking around talking to people and saying, how are we going to define the George Randle days as leader of this? What would you say? And you have the ability to hear that. Think of the words that would make, that you feel good about cognitively, that your head would say, wow, that's really good that I came across that way, that I was able to impress people like. But get your heart involved with that too. Like, what's something you may not get misty-eyed over about this stuff, but what would something that an employee would say, like, I'm a better human being because George was my leader, or whatever it is, that would get your heart involved. Because at some point in my coaching, I've got to introduce them to getting involved in their somatic or their body awareness as a data point. And so I might as well start off up front with the fact you're not going to see my MBA coaching you because we're not going to talk about business. We're going to talk about leadership and your leadership of the business, but I'm not going to talk about your margins or your return on investment. Perfectly capable of doing it, but that's not what you're hiring me for. I know, by the way, I don't have the kind of insurance that would cover me giving that advice, so I'm not going there.
Well, one of the questions was, I was going to ask you, what are the great tips? But the humility, the lifelong learner, we're going to go capture those out and put them out as a lead into this episode because they're great. So as we're wrapping up, this is the one question that I give to everybody. And just as personal development. So if you were to go back 10, 15 years to 22-year-old Bill Gardner self, we do not give away age on this program for anything. If you were to go back to right as you were to graduate college and stuff, what would you tell yourself to be better, to be more successful holistically, not necessarily financially, whatever that means to you, and for things to be easier for you? What would you tell yourself, those lessons that you have now that you wish you learned then? We'll close with that.
Yeah, so this was pretty easy for me. So just a moment of background. I grew up as the baby and the only boy in a family, and I was spoiled beyond all reason. And trust me, I could tell you, if I haven't already, I could tell you stories that you would go, oh my God, you were spoiled. That's ridiculous. But at 14, I lost my mother to cancer, and a month before my 16th birthday, I lost my father to a heart attack. And they were 47 and 52, so I'm not talking about old people. So almost overnight, I went from spoiled beyond all reason to independent. And so what that meant for me when I went away to college was my aunts and uncles, very well-meaning relatives who were trying to take care of their sister or their brother's child, they pushed me because I was good in math and science to go into pre-med. And so I went off and started college as a pre-med student. I lasted as a pre-med almost 16 hours because they made all the pre-med students go to a presentation called So You Think You Want to Be a Doctor.
Oh, God.
And Dr. Mickelson, I'll never forget his name because I walked out and changed my major. And one aunt in particular said, you got to go into banking because I know you're kind of lazy and banker's hours are a real thing, and you have to be personable and social and get along with people and take them to lunch, stuff like that. So you should really go into banking and finance, which I did. And you're good in math also. So I did go into that. And I wish that I had done some self-examination or worked with a guidance counselor or something to say, really, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because it wouldn't have been a banker. So if I would go back at 18 or whatever, when I left for college, I would probably go back in there and say, do you really want to do that? Or are you just doing it to please an aunt or an uncle? Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, if you fast forward to my first night of the MBA program in a class with my eventual mentor, he did an exercise where we paired up and interviewed each other and then introduced the person. It's called Peter Paul Introductions. And I ended up in a group of 7, and so I didn't have anybody match with me, so he interviewed me. And it was brutal because I worked my butt off. I asked him a lot of yes and no questions and stuff like that. And when it was his turn to interview me, he looked at his watch. He said, I got 5 minutes to interview you, so I'm going to set my timer. Tell me everything there is about you that is important for me to know, for me to work with you this quarter. So I kind of spilled my guts, and at the end of class, he said, Mr. Gardner, he gave us our homework, Mr. Gardner, would you come up? I need to speak with you for just a second. So I waited. As the last person left, he said, I have a question for you based on our conversation tonight. I said, okay. He said, when will you start living your own dream? And I wish I could say I was insightful a really insightful guy. And I went, wow, what a great question. I'm going to go ponder that. But to be honest, it made me really angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt my face get red and my ears got red. And I thought, who is this jerk? He had talked to me for 5 minutes and he's asking me a question like that. But I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, my knowledge was, wow, I'm living my aunts and uncles' dreams. I need to think about what it is I want to be. And that's what I did in the course of the MBA program by taking all of his courses and his business partners. They later formed the Atlanta Consulting Group, and he wrote Managing from the Heart. And I worked with them both in the group I talked about earlier in the faculty group, but also I started working consulting with them. So I think I would have been much further along in my career, would have felt much more successful earlier had I just had his advice 4 years before that.
I think it's great advice. Live your own life. And I go back and look over my years and I want to be arrogant and say I was living my own life. But I know that I'm like the ice cream cone and everybody else is putting the ice cream in. I'm living what everybody else, the flavors they give me. And it's kind of how I look at it. I can't thank you enough. I mean, sage advice. Everybody ought to listen to that, especially for the leaders to be lifelong learners. That's what we're trying to be, and we hope to deliver on this podcast. But my friend, I am just grateful I get to start the new year talking with you. I will send good thoughts that we both start to breathe semi-normally.
Thank you.
Because the cedar is not going away. But hopefully we can do this again. But I can't thank you enough, Bill. It's just been absolutely wonderful and just filled with brilliant insights, which we'll get out and we'll get you a clip as soon as we get done. But thank you so much. Have a great, great new year, and we'll chat again soon.
Thanks, George. I appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to the Talent War podcast, where we discuss all things talent, focusing on a true talent mindset, which is a core belief that the only true competitive advantage you can hope to achieve and maintain is your talent. Join us for the next episode of the Talent War podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, subscribe, please leave a review, and connect with Dr. Tom Lokar and myself on Talent War Group's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram accounts, and send your comments and inquiries to media@Talent War Group. The Talent War podcast is brought to you by the Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, seminars, and executive coaching, we will work with you to create talent solutions to your business problems. To get started, please visit us at www.talentwargroup.com.